Ma'am, claiming stolen valor is a federal crime. Hospital corpsmen don't deploy with SEAL teams, and women sure as hell don't conduct direct action missions. You're either delusional or you're scamming veteran benefits. Staff Sergeant Blake Crowley's voice cut through the Navy recruitment center like a blade, each word designed to humiliate. His steel-gray eyes bore into Selena Reyes, who stood frozen near the benefits desk, her face flushing crimson as 15 pairs of eyes turned to stare. The morning sun streaming through the large windows cast harsh shadows across the room, making the scene feel like a public execution. Selena felt her shoulders automatically straighten, her spine aligning with military precision despite the chaos erupting around her. The movement was instinctive, drilled into her bones through years of training she couldn't discuss. Her dark eyes swept the room, cataloging exits and potential threats with the methodical efficiency of someone who had learned that survival depended on constant awareness. "Sergeant Crowley, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Selena said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She had come to the recruitment center to inquire about updating her veteran identification card, a simple administrative task that should have taken 20 minutes. Instead, she found herself at the center of a nightmare that threatened to unravel everything she had worked to protect. Crowley stepped closer, his bulk intimidating in the cramped space between desks. Behind him, other military personnel and civilian applicants watched with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. Some pulled out phones, ready to record what they assumed would be the exposure of another stolen valor case. The air grew thick with tension and anticipation. "No misunderstanding, ma'am," Crowley continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Petty Officer Knox here ran your records. Selena Reyes, Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class, served 2010 to 2014. No combat deployments, no special operations training, no decorations for valor. Yet you just told Mrs. Henderson at the benefits desk that you served with SEAL teams in Afghanistan and participated in direct action missions." Petty Officer Amanda Knox emerged from behind the computer terminal, her blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her expression a mixture of righteous anger and professional satisfaction. She carried a manila folder thick with printouts, evidence of what she believed to be an open and shut case of military fraud. "Ma'am, impersonating military personnel is serious enough," Knox said, her voice sharp and clipped. "But claiming to be a Navy SEAL when women weren't even allowed in combat roles during your service period? That's either mental illness or criminal fraud. Either way, we're calling the authorities." The room erupted in murmurs. An elderly veteran near the wall shook his head in disgust. A young woman applying for officer candidate school looked horrified. Two Marines in dress blues exchanged knowing glances, having seen similar cases before. Selena felt the weight of their judgment crushing down on her, each whispered comment adding to the suffocating atmosphere. Like and subscribe if you want to see justice served to those who dare challenge our heroes. Because this story is about to take a turn that will shock everyone in that room. Selena's breathing remained controlled, but her heart rate had increased. She recognized the signs of an ambush, the careful coordination between Crowley and Knox, the way they had positioned themselves to block her path to the main exit. These weren't random accusations. This was a planned confrontation designed to maximize humiliation and minimize her options for response. "I never claimed to be a Navy SEAL," Selena said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that everything she said could be used against her. "I said I served with special operations units in a medical capacity. There's a difference." Crowley laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the institutional walls. "Right. And I'm sure you just happen to be attached to classified units that nobody can verify. Classic stolen valor playbook. Tell us something we can't check, claim it's all classified, hope we're too stupid to call your bluff." Knox consulted her paperwork, reading from official documents with bureaucratic efficiency. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class Selena Reyes completed basic medical training at Great Lakes Naval Training Center, served at Naval Hospital Camp Pendleton, Naval Medical Center San Diego, and Naval Hospital 29 Palms. Administrative discharge 2014. No overseas deployments, no combat service, no special qualifications beyond basic medical certification. Each word hit Selena like a physical blow. The official record was accurate as far as it went, but it told only the smallest fraction of her story. The real record, the one that mattered, existed in classified databases that these people couldn't access. It was buried under layers of security classification designed to protect not just operations, but the people who had participated in them. Records can be incomplete, Selena said, her voice gaining strength, especially for certain types of service that require discretion. Discretion? Crowley's voice rose an octave. Lady, you're talking about the United States Navy, not some shadow organization from a movie. Every deployment, every assignment, every decoration gets recorded. If it's not in the system, it didn't happen. An older veteran near the back of the room stood up slowly. Jimmy Torres had salt and pepper hair and walked with a slight limp, evidence of his own military service. He had been watching the confrontation with growing unease, something about Selena's demeanor triggering recognition in his experienced eyes. Sergeant, maybe you should slow down here, Torres said, his gravelly voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen real combat. I've been around long enough to know that sometimes the official record doesn't tell the whole story. This lady carries herself like she's been in the field. Knox wheeled around to face Torres, her expression shifting to include him in her growing circle of suspicion. Sir, with respect, stolen valor criminals are experts at mimicking military bearing. They study how real veterans act and copy the behavior. It's part of the deception. Torres shook his head, moving closer to get a better look at Selena. His trained eyes noticed details that others missed. The way she stood with her weight evenly distributed, ready to move in any direction. How her eyes continued to sweep the room even while under verbal attack. The unconscious way she positioned herself near the wall to maintain tactical advantage. No, ma'am, Torres said firmly. You can't fake what I'm seeing. This woman has been in situations where split-second decisions meant life or death. You develop instincts that don't go away. Crowley's face reddened with anger. Mr. Torres, I appreciate your service, but you're being manipulated by a con artist. These people prey on veterans' willingness to give each other the benefit of the doubt. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. Selena felt a surge of gratitude toward Torres, the first person to recognize something authentic in her behavior. But she also felt the danger of his support. The more people who believed her story, the more pressure there would be to provide proof she couldn't give. The classified nature of her real service meant that Vindication would require exposing information that could endanger lives. Knox returned to her computer terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up additional screens. I'm running a cross-reference with all Special Operations databases, she announced to the room. SEAL teams, Special Forces, Marine Recon, Air Force Special Operations Command. If Ms. Reyes served with any Special Operations unit, it will show up somewhere in the system. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Selena knew what the search would reveal. Nothing. Her service had been compartmentalized in ways that made verification impossible through normal channels. She had operated under classifications that existed in databases these people couldn't access, protected by security measures designed to keep her safe even years after her discharge. Search complete, Knox announced triumphantly. 0 matches. Selena Reyes has never been associated with any Special Operations unit in any capacity. No training, no deployments, no assignments, no evaluations. The woman is a complete fraud. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Selena felt the final walls of her carefully constructed civilian life beginning to crumble. She had spent years building a quiet existence, working at a community center, helping other veterans navigate their own transitions to civilian life. Now all of that was threatened by her past catching up with her in the worst possible way. Crowley pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. Ma'am, I'm calling Naval Criminal Investigative Service. This is now a federal matter. I strongly suggest you sit down and wait quietly for the investigators to arrive. Wait, Selena said, raising her hand in a gesture that was both surrender and request for time. Before you make that call, let me ask you something. If I were making this up, if I were some kind of criminal trying to scam the system, would I really choose a story this easy to disprove? Would I really claim service that could be verified with a simple database search? Knox crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. Criminals aren't always smart, ma'am. Maybe you thought we wouldn't check. Maybe you figured veteran solidarity would protect you. Maybe you're just desperate enough to try anything. Selena shook her head slowly. Or maybe the reason you can't find my record is because it's classified at levels you don't have access to. Maybe there are types of service that don't appear in standard databases for security reasons. Maybe the system you're searching isn't designed to show everything. That's convenient, Crowley said sarcastically. Super secret missions that nobody can verify. Classic defense. Next, you'll be telling us about CIA black sites and alien conspiracies. I'm telling you that during wartime, when American lives are at stake, sometimes unusual arrangements are made, Selena replied. Sometimes people serve in ways that don't fit standard protocols. Sometimes the mission requires flexibility that doesn't match peacetime regulations. Torres nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I've heard stories, he said quietly. Things that happened downrange that never made it into official reports. Operations that required people with specific skills regardless of their official military occupational specialty. Knox turned her skeptical gaze on Torres. Sir, you're talking about conspiracy theories. The military has procedures, protocols, chain of command. Everything gets documented. Everything gets recorded. There are no secret programs using people outside their assigned roles. Are you absolutely certain about that? Selena asked, her voice taking on an edge that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. Are you willing to stake your career on the assumption that you have access to every database, every classification level, every compartmentalized program that existed during the height of the War on Terror? The question hung in the air, creating a moment of uncertainty that hadn't existed before. Knox's confidence wavered slightly as she considered the implications. Military personnel learned early in their careers that there were always things they didn't know, operations they weren't cleared for, information that existed above their level of access. Crowley, however, remained unmoved. Ma'am, you're trying to create doubt where none should exist. The burden of proof is on you. If you served in special operations, prove it. Show us documentation, provide references, give us something concrete that we can verify. Selena felt the trap closing around her. Everything they were asking for existed, but it existed in places she couldn't access and couldn't reveal. Her real record contained operations that were still classified, people who were still at risk, information that could compromise ongoing missions if exposed. The very secrecy that had protected her during her service now threatened to destroy her in civilian life. I can provide references, she said carefully, but they would need to be contacted through appropriate security channels. The people who can verify my service hold clearances that require special protocols for communication. Knox laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Of course they do. Let me guess. We need to call some mysterious number, use special code words, and wait for someone who may or may not exist to confirm your story. How convenient that none of your references can be reached through normal channels. Some things are more important than convenience, Selena replied. Some information is protected for reasons that go beyond individual careers or reputations. Crowley had heard enough. His finger moved toward his phone screen, preparing to make the call that would transform this from a verbal confrontation into a criminal investigation. Ma'am, you've had multiple opportunities to provide verifiable proof of your claims. Since you can't or won't do that, we're moving to the next phase. Sergeant, wait, Torres interjected, stepping between Crowley and Selena. What's the harm in making a few phone calls before you involve NCIS? If she's telling the truth, you're about to ruin the life of a legitimate veteran. If she's lying, a few more hours won't change the outcome. Knox shook her head firmly. Sir, we can't waste investigative resources chasing ghosts. This woman has had every opportunity to substantiate her claims through normal channels. The fact that she can't proves she's lying. Selena watched the argument develop around her, feeling like a spectator at her own trial. The bureaucratic machinery was grinding into motion, propelled by regulations and procedures that couldn't account for the complexity of her situation. She understood their perspective. From their point of view, she appeared to be exactly what they accused her of being. But she also understood something they didn't: the real cost of exposure. Somewhere in the world, people she had served with were still operating in dangerous places. Operations she had been part of were still classified because they connected to ongoing missions. Her silence wasn't just about protecting herself, it was about protecting a network of people whose lives depended on operational security. The door to the recruitment center opened with a sharp chime, admitting a young woman in Navy working uniform. Corpsman Kelly Wright approached the group cautiously, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, obviously responding to a call about a disturbance. Her eyes swept the scene, taking in the tense standoff and the crowd of onlookers. "What's the situation here?" Wright asked, her voice calm and professional despite the obvious tension in the room. Knox quickly briefed her on the situation, describing Selena as a stolen valor case who was refusing to cooperate with investigation. Wright listened carefully, but her attention kept returning to Selina, studying her with the trained eye of someone who had worked with many different types of military personnel. "Ma'am," Wright said, addressing Selina directly, "I'm going to ask you some basic questions about military medical procedures. If you're actually a corpsman, you should be able to answer them easily." Selina nodded, recognizing this as a fair test of her claimed background. "Go ahead." Wright started with simple questions about basic medical training, procedures for treating trauma injuries, protocols for handling medical emergencies in field conditions. Selina answered each question accurately and completely, providing not just textbook responses, but practical insights that could only come from real experience. As the questioning continued, Wright's expression began to change. Selina wasn't just reciting memorized information. She was speaking from experience, adding details and nuances that revealed deep understanding of combat medicine. Her responses included practical tips that weren't taught in basic training, field expedients that could only be learned through actual deployment experience. "How would you treat a sucking chest wound in a desert environment with limited supplies?" Wright asked, escalating the complexity of her questions. Selina's response was immediate and detailed. "Occlusive dressing if available, improvised with plastic wrap or even duct tape if necessary. Monitor for tension pneumothorax, be prepared for needle decompression. In desert conditions, watch for sand contamination of the wound site. If you don't have proper IV fluids, you might need to consider oral rehydration if the patient is conscious and not vomiting." Wright raised an eyebrow. The response was accurate, but it included details about improvised treatment methods that went beyond standard training. "What about treating a traumatic amputation when medevac is 30 minutes out?" "Control bleeding first, obviously," Selina replied without hesitation. "Pressure points, tourniquets if you have them, improvised tourniquets if you don't. Don't worry about saving the severed limb unless you can keep it cool and transport is immediate. Focus on keeping the patient alive. Talk to them, keep them conscious, monitor for shock. Sometimes you have to make hard choices about triage when you have multiple casualties." The clinical precision of her answers combined with the emotional weight behind them convinced Wright that this wasn't someone reciting from a textbook. This was someone who had actually been in situations where these skills meant the difference between life and death. Knox, however, remained skeptical. "Anyone can memorize medical procedures. That doesn't prove she served in special operations." "You're right," Wright agreed. "But it does prove she's actually a trained corpsman with real experience. The question is where and how she got that experience if it's not in her official record." Selina felt a glimmer of hope as Wright's support joined Torres's in creating at least some doubt about the accusations against her. But she also knew that medical knowledge alone wouldn't be enough to prove her claims about Special Operations Service. That would require evidence she couldn't provide without compromising information that needed to remain secret. Crowley, growing impatient with the extended questioning, stepped forward with his phone in hand. "This has gone on long enough. Medical knowledge doesn't prove Special Operations Service. Plenty of corpsmen serve in conventional units and gain experience with trauma medicine. We're calling NCIS now." "Sergeant, please," Selina said, her voice carrying a note of desperation for the first time. "I understand your skepticism, but there are ways to verify my service without compromising security. There are people who can vouch for me if you contact them through appropriate channels." Knox consulted her watch, a gesture that clearly indicated her patience was exhausted. "Ma'am, you've had over an hour to provide verifiable proof of your claims. Every time we ask for evidence, you give us excuses about security and classified information. Either produce something concrete or accept the consequences of your deception." The ultimatum landed like a physical blow. Selina realized that she had reached the end of the road with conventional explanations. Either she would have to reveal information that could compromise security, or she would have to accept being branded as a fraud and face the legal consequences. Neither option was acceptable. "I need to make a phone call," she said finally. "One call to someone who can verify my service without revealing classified information." Crowley shook his head. "Ma'am, you're not under arrest yet, so you're free to make whatever calls you want. But we're proceeding with the investigation regardless. If your mysterious contact can prove your story, they can do it to the federal investigators." Selina pulled out her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through her contacts. The person she needed to call was someone she hadn't spoken to in years, someone who knew the truth about her service but who also understood the delicate nature of the information they shared. It was a risk to involve him, but she was running out of alternatives. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "This is a secured line." "Doc calling Bravo 6 actual," Selena said quietly, using call signs that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. "I need emergency verification for hostile contact." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Doc, that's impossible. Doc was declared killed in action in 2011. Kandahar Province, grid reference Foxtrot 77, IED detonation during structure clearing operation," Selena replied, providing details that only someone who had been there could know. "You carried me 200 meters to the landing zone with a dislocated shoulder." Another pause, longer this time. "Jesus. Doc, where are you? What kind of trouble are you in?" "Stolen valor accusations at Naval Station San Diego. They can't find my service record in standard databases. I need someone with appropriate clearance to verify my background without compromising operational security." "Doc, you know I can't do that over an unsecured line. The nature of your service requires—" The phone was suddenly snatched from Selena's hand by Crowley, who ended the call before she could finish the conversation. "Ma'am, we're not going to let you coordinate your story with Confederates. If you have legitimate contacts, they can speak to federal investigators through proper channels." Selena stared at him in disbelief. "You just destroyed my ability to prove my innocence through appropriate security protocols. That call was going to someone who could verify my service without compromising classified information." "Convenient story," Knox said dismissively. "More likely you were calling someone to help fabricate evidence or coordinate false testimony. We've seen these schemes before." Torres stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Sergeant, you're making a serious mistake here. That call sounded legitimate. She used specific terminology and provided details that suggest real operational knowledge." "Mr. Torres, please step back," Crowley commanded. "You're interfering with an ongoing investigation. Unless you want to be charged as an accessory, I suggest you let us do our job." The threat hung in the air like acrid smoke. Torres reluctantly stepped back, but his expression made it clear that he believed Selena was being railroaded by a system more interested in protecting itself than discovering the truth. Wright continued to study Selena with professional interest. Something about her demeanor, her knowledge, and her responses didn't fit the profile of a typical stolen valor case. But the weight of official procedure and the absence of verifiable records created an almost insurmountable presumption of guilt. Crowley pressed a number on his phone, the electronic tones echoing in the now silent room. "NCIS, this is Staff Sergeant Blake Crowley at Naval Station San Diego. I need to report a suspected case of stolen valor with potential federal fraud implications." As he spoke to the investigators, describing Selena's claims and the lack of supporting evidence, she felt the walls closing in around her. In a few minutes, federal agents would arrive to take her into custody. Her carefully constructed civilian life would be shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of criminal prosecution for crimes she hadn't committed. But more than her personal situation, she worried about the implications for the people she had served with. If this case became public, if her real background was investigated and exposed, it could compromise operations and endanger lives. The secrecy that had protected them all was about to be torn away by a bureaucratic system that couldn't understand the complexity of what they had done. What do you think? Is Selena telling the truth about her military service, or is this an elaborate deception? Comment below with your theory, because what happens next will shock everyone. 20 minutes later, Agent Marcus Phillips arrived at the recruitment center with the efficient dispatch of someone who had handled dozens of similar cases. He was a man in his 40s with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent years dealing with military fraud. His briefcase contained forms, procedures, and precedents for handling stolen valor prosecutions. "Staff Sergeant Crowley," he asked, identifying himself with a badge and credentials. "I understand you have a suspected stolen valor case." Crowley quickly briefed Agent Phillips on the situation, presenting Selena's claims as obviously fraudulent and easily disproven. He emphasized the absence of supporting records and her reliance on supposedly classified information that couldn't be verified. Agent Phillips studied Selena with the practiced eye of an investigator who had learned to distinguish between genuine veterans and skilled imposters. He noted her military bearing, her controlled responses under pressure, and the way she held herself even while under intense scrutiny. "Ms. Reyes," he said, his voice professionally neutral, "I'm Agent Phillips with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I need to advise you that you're the subject of an investigation into potential violations of federal law regarding fraudulent military claims." Selena nodded, having expected this development. "Agent Phillips, I understand the seriousness of these accusations, but I maintain that my service record exists in classified databases that these people don't have access to. Phillips consulted his tablet, pulling up preliminary information about the case. Ma'am, I've been investigating military fraud for 8 years. I've heard every possible explanation for missing records, and claims about classified service are among the most common. The reality is that military service is documented, period. If it happened, there's a record of it somewhere. Not always, Selina replied carefully. During the height of the War on Terror, some operations required personnel to serve in capacities that didn't match their official military occupational specialty. These arrangements were sometimes documented in compartmentalized systems that aren't accessible through normal channels. Phillips had heard similar claims before, but something about Selina's delivery gave him pause. She wasn't making wild assertions about secret missions or dramatic heroics. Her explanation was measured, specific, and delivered with the kind of precision that suggested real knowledge of how compartmentalized operations actually worked. Ms. Reyes, can you provide any specific details about your alleged service? Unit designations, commanding officers, deployment locations, anything that might help verify your claims? Selina hesitated, knowing that any details she provided could compromise operational security if they were investigated too thoroughly. But she also recognized that some information might be necessary to establish her credibility. I served as a combat medic attached to special operations units in Afghanistan between 2011 and 2013, she said. My primary role was medical support, but I was cross-trained for direct action missions when medical expertise was required for mission success. Phillips typed notes on his tablet, recording her statement for future verification attempts. Which specific units were you attached to? That information is classified, Selina replied. But the verification call I was attempting to make was to someone who served as my team leader and could confirm my service through appropriate security channels. Knox interjected from across the room. Agent Phillips, she claims the call was to verify her story, but it could just as easily have been to coordinate false testimony. We can't allow her to manipulate the investigation. Phillips nodded, understanding the concern while also recognizing the complexity of investigating claims that involved classified information. Ms. Reyes, if your service was truly classified, there should be protocols for verification that don't compromise security. Are you willing to provide the contact information for your alleged references? Selina knew this was dangerous territory. Providing contact information would inevitably lead to official inquiries that could expose information meant to remain secret, but refusing would be seen as further evidence of deception. The person I was calling operates under security restrictions that require special protocols for contact, she explained. Simply providing a phone number wouldn't be sufficient. The verification process would need to go through official channels with appropriate clearances. Agent Phillips studied her response, noting both its specificity and its convenient untestability. In his experience, people who claimed classified service usually provided vague explanations that couldn't be verified. Selina's responses were different. More precise, more technically accurate, but also more frustrating from an investigative standpoint. Ma'am, I'm going to be direct with you, Phillips said. The claims you're making are extremely unusual. Women were not officially allowed in combat roles during the time frame you're discussing, and attachment of hospital corpsmen to special operations units in direct action capacities would have been highly irregular. You're asking me to believe that you were involved in operations that violated multiple official policies. Selina met his gaze steadily. Agent Phillips, I'm asking you to consider that during wartime, when American lives are at stake, sometimes official policies are less important than mission requirements. Sometimes the military makes exceptions to regulations when operational necessity demands it. Torres, who had been listening to the exchange with growing concern, stepped forward again. Agent Phillips, if I may, this woman demonstrates knowledge and bearing that's consistent with real combat experience. Her medical knowledge is extensive and practical, not textbook. Her responses under pressure show training and discipline. She may be telling the truth about irregular service. Agent Phillips acknowledged Torres with a nod, but his expression remained skeptical. Sir, I appreciate your perspective, but my job is to investigate based on evidence, not impressions. If Ms. Reyes served in the capacity she claims, there should be some record of it somewhere, even if that record is classified. Wright approached the group, having completed her own assessment of Selina's claimed medical background. Agent Phillips, I've questioned Ms. Reyes extensively about combat medical procedures. Her knowledge is not only accurate but includes practical details that suggest real field experience. She knows things that aren't taught in standard corpsman training. Medical knowledge doesn't prove special operations service, Knox pointed out. Hospital corpsmen can gain trauma experience in many different environments. True, Wright acknowledged, but her knowledge is specifically oriented toward combat conditions, improvised treatment methods, and mass casualty situations. That's not typical of hospital corpsmen who serve in conventional medical facilities. Agent Phillips processed this information, adding it to his growing assessment of the case. The evidence was contradictory. Official records that showed no special operations service, but knowledge and behavior that suggested possible combat experience. It was exactly the kind of complex case that could consume weeks of investigation time with uncertain results. Ms. Reyes, he said finally, I'm going to give you one more opportunity to provide concrete evidence of your claimed service. Documentation, personal effects, anything physical that might support your story. If you can't produce something verifiable, I'll have no choice but to proceed with federal charges. Selina reached slowly into her pocket, her movement carefully controlled to avoid appearing threatening. She withdrew a small, worn challenge coin, its metal surface dulled by years of handling. The coin bore symbols that were immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with special operations: an eagle, a trident, and an anchor, but with specific modifications that marked it as belonging to a particular unit and time period. She placed the coin on the desk between herself and Agent Phillips, the metallic clink echoing in the suddenly quiet room. This was given to me by my team leader after a mission in Afghanistan. The symbols are modified from standard SEAL team coins to reflect our specific unit designation and operational parameters. Agent Phillips picked up the coin, examining it closely. The craftsmanship was excellent, the wear patterns consistent with years of handling, and the modifications to the standard design were subtle but significant. It wasn't the kind of item that could be easily counterfeited or purchased from a military surplus store. Interesting, he murmured, photographing the coin from multiple angles with his phone. The modifications are very specific. Do you know what they represent? Selina nodded. The eagle's wings are positioned at a 73-degree angle instead of the standard 90 degrees. That represents our deployment time frame. The coordinates engraved below the anchor mark the location where our unit first deployed. The date underneath represents when I was cleared for direct action missions. Knox moved closer to examine the coin, her skepticism evident but shaken by the level of detail in Selina's explanation. Anyone could make up a story about what symbols mean. This doesn't prove anything except that you have access to military memorabilia. Maybe, Agent Phillips said thoughtfully, but the level of detail suggests either genuine knowledge or an extremely sophisticated deception. The modifications aren't random. They follow patterns that would be consistent with how special operations units actually customize their insignia. Torres leaned forward to get a better look at the coin. Agent Phillips, I've seen challenge coins from dozens of different units over the years. This one has details that you can't fake. The wear patterns, the metal composition, the precision of the engraving. This is legitimate military issue, not some replica. Wright studied the coin as well, noting the same details that had impressed Torres. The craftsmanship is military standard, and the wear suggests this has been carried for years. It's not something that was recently acquired for the purpose of supporting a false claim. Agent Phillips continued to examine the coin, his investigative instincts telling him that this was significant evidence even though he couldn't immediately verify its authenticity. The coin represented exactly the kind of physical proof that was often missing in stolen valor cases, but its unofficial nature made verification difficult. Ms. Reyes, he said, assuming this coin is authentic, it suggests that you did serve in some capacity with a special operations unit. However, it doesn't resolve the discrepancy between your claims and your official record. Can you explain why documentation of such service wouldn't appear in standard military databases? Selina chose her words carefully, knowing that she was walking a line between providing enough information to establish credibility and revealing details that could compromise security. During the time frame in question, certain operations required personnel to serve under arrangements that weren't reflected in standard personnel records. These arrangements were documented in compartmentalized systems designed to protect operational security. Compartmentalized how? Agent Phillips asked, his investigative training pushing him to understand the specific mechanics of what Selina was claiming. Information about personnel involved in certain operations was separated from their standard service records and maintained in databases with restricted access, Selena explained. This protected both the operations and the personnel involved from potential compromise if standard records were accessed by unauthorized individuals. Knox shook her head dismissively. That sounds like conspiracy theory nonsense. The military doesn't operate secret personnel databases. Everything gets documented through normal channels. Does it? Selena asked, her voice taking on an edge that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. Are you absolutely certain that you have access to every database, every classification level, every compartmentalized program that existed during the height of the War on Terror? The question created a moment of uncomfortable silence. Even the most experienced military personnel understood that there were always things they didn't know, operations they weren't cleared for, information that existed above their level of access. Agent Phillips recognized the validity of Selena's point, even while remaining skeptical of her specific claims. Compartmentalized programs did exist, and it was theoretically possible that personnel records could be separated from standard databases for security reasons. But such arrangements would be extremely unusual and would require high-level authorization. Ms. Reyes, if your service was compartmentalized as you describe, there should be protocols for verification that don't compromise security. Are you willing to identify the specific program or operation you were involved in so that we can pursue appropriate verification channels? Selena felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Providing specific information about operations would allow verification, but it would also risk exposing details that were meant to remain classified. People she had served with could be compromised if their connection to compartmentalized operations became known. Agent Phillips, the operations I was involved in are still classified because they connect to ongoing missions and personnel who are still at risk, she said quietly. Exposing details about those operations, even for the purpose of proving my service, could endanger lives. The explanation was both logical and infuriating from an investigative standpoint. If true, it meant that Selena's claims might be impossible to verify through normal channels. If false, it provided the perfect excuse for why no supporting evidence could be produced. Crowley, who had been growing increasingly impatient with the extended investigation, stepped forward with his phone in hand. Agent Phillips, this woman has had every opportunity to provide verifiable proof of her claims. Every time we ask for evidence, she gives us excuses about security and classified information. I think it's time to proceed with charges. Agent Phillips looked around the room, taking in the faces of everyone involved in the confrontation. Torres and Wright appeared convinced that Selena was telling the truth, while Crowley and Knox remained certain she was a fraud. The physical evidence was suggestive but not conclusive, and Selena's explanations were both sophisticated and conveniently unverifiable. Ms. Reyes, he said finally, based on the evidence available and your inability to provide verifiable documentation of your claimed service, I'm placing you under arrest for violations of 18 U.S.C. 912, fraudulent claims about military service. The words hit the room like an explosion. Torres protested loudly while Wright shook her head in disgust. Knox and Crowley exchanged satisfied glances, vindicated by the official confirmation of their suspicions. Selena stood quietly, having expected this outcome but still feeling the weight of injustice crushing down on her. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Phillips continued, reading from a card as he approached with handcuffs. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. As the metal cuffs clicked around her wrists, Selena felt the finality of the moment. Her quiet civilian life was over, destroyed by accusations she couldn't disprove without compromising information that needed to remain secret. In 72 hours, she would be transferred to federal custody to await trial for crimes she hadn't committed. But as she was led toward the door, Selena carried herself with the same dignity that had marked her throughout the confrontation. She had faced enemy fire and survived impossible situations. She would find a way to survive this as well, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had built to protect the people she had served with. The recruitment center door closed behind them with a final, decisive click, leaving behind a room full of people trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Some believed they had seen justice served to a fraud. Others feared they had watched the destruction of a genuine hero. Only time would reveal which assessment was correct. But in 72 hours, the truth would begin to emerge in ways that none of them could have imagined. The holding cell at Naval Station San Diego felt smaller than the interrogation rooms where Selena had spent countless hours during her deployments. Gray concrete walls enclosed a space barely large enough for the metal bench where she sat, her wrists still bearing the red marks from the handcuffs that had been removed only minutes ago. Through the small reinforced window, she could see the Pacific Ocean stretching toward the horizon, a view that reminded her of the freedom she had lost. 72 hours. That was how long Agent Phillips had given her before federal marshals would arrive to transport her to a detention facility pending trial. 72 hours to somehow prove a service record that existed in databases she couldn't access, protected by classifications she couldn't breach, verified by people she couldn't contact through normal channels. The heavy metal door opened with a grinding sound that echoed off the concrete walls. Corpsman Kelly Wright stepped inside, carrying a medical kit and wearing an expression of professional concern mixed with personal curiosity. She had volunteered to conduct the routine medical assessment required for all detainees, but her real motivation was the lingering questions about Selena's background. "Ms. Reyes," Wright said, settling onto the bench across from Selena, "I need to complete a standard medical evaluation, but I also wanted to speak with you privately about something I observed during the confrontation." Selena looked up, meeting Wright's gaze with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. "What did you observe, Corpsman?" Wright opened her medical kit, but her attention remained focused on Selena rather than her equipment. "Your scars. When Staff Sergeant Crowley grabbed your arm, I noticed defensive wounds on your forearms, slash patterns that suggest knife combat. And earlier, when you rolled up your sleeves, I saw what looked like shrapnel scars on your shoulders." The observation was delivered with clinical precision, but Wright's voice carried an undertone of recognition that suggested she understood the significance of what she had seen. Combat scars told stories that official records sometimes couldn't capture, marking bodies with evidence of experiences that existed beyond bureaucratic documentation. "Scars tell stories," Selena replied carefully. "Sometimes those stories are complicated." Wright nodded, continuing her examination while maintaining the conversation. "The patterns are very specific. Defensive knife wounds typically occur when someone is trained to use their forearms to block attacks. The shrapnel scars show blast patterns consistent with IED explosions. These aren't injuries you get from accidents or conventional medical training." Selena remained silent, but her expression confirmed Wright's assessment. The scars were indeed evidence of combat experience, physical proof of situations that had required split-second decisions between life and death. Each mark represented a moment when her training and instincts had meant the difference between survival and becoming another casualty statistic. "Corpsman Wright," Selena said finally, "if I told you that some military service exists in spaces between official records, would you believe that was possible?" Wright paused in her examination, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Her own experience with military bureaucracy had shown her that official documentation didn't always capture the complete picture of what happened in operational environments. "I've seen enough inconsistencies between what actually happens downrange and what gets recorded officially to know that the system isn't perfect," Wright replied. "Combat zones create situations that don't always fit into standard reporting protocols." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Agent Phillips appeared at the door, his expression grim as he delivered an update on the investigation's progress. "Ms. Reyes," he said, "I've spent the past 6 hours attempting to verify your claims through every channel available to me. I've contacted personnel records, special operations commands, medical databases, and deployment rosters. The result is the same everywhere. No record of Selena Reyes serving in any special operations capacity." Selena felt the weight of inevitability settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had known this would be the outcome, but hearing it stated officially made the reality inescapable. Her service existed in compartmentalized systems that these people couldn't access, protected by security measures designed to keep both operations and personnel safe from exposure. "Agent Phillips," she said quietly, "the absence of records in standard databases doesn't prove those records don't exist elsewhere. It proves that if they do exist, they're protected by security classifications that prevent normal access." Phillips acknowledged the logical validity of her argument while maintaining his investigative skepticism. "Ms. Reyes, I understand the theoretical possibility of compartmentalized records, but my job requires evidence, not theories. If such records exist, there should be protocols for accessing them that don't compromise security. Wright completed her medical assessment and closed her kit, but she remained in the cell, clearly reluctant to leave Selena alone with the weight of an uncertain future. Something about the situation troubled her professional instincts, the same instincts that had helped her distinguish between genuine patients and those seeking to manipulate medical systems. "Agent Phillips," Wright said, "I've completed the medical evaluation, and I need to report that Ms. Reyes shows physical evidence consistent with combat experience. Her scars are authentic indicators of knife combat and explosive blast exposure. This supports at least part of her claimed background." Phillips noted this information but remained unmoved in his overall assessment. Corpsman Wright, combat scars don't necessarily prove special operations service. Personnel can be exposed to combat in many different capacities. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor outside. Raised voices suggested some kind of urgent situation developing elsewhere in the facility. Through the reinforced window, Selena could see personnel moving with the kind of purposeful speed that indicated something significant was happening. "What's going on out there?" Wright asked, moving toward the door to get a better view of the activity. Agent Phillips stepped into the corridor to investigate, leaving the door open as he spoke with other personnel. His voice carried back into the cell as he gathered information about the developing situation. "Transport team is here early," Phillips announced, returning to the doorway. "Federal marshals arrived ahead of schedule. They want to take custody immediately instead of waiting the full 72 hours. Selena felt her heart rate increase as the reality of immediate transfer hit her. She had hoped for more time to somehow find a way to prove her case, but that hope was being taken away by bureaucratic efficiency. In minutes, she would be in federal custody, officially branded as a fraud, and facing years in prison for crimes she hadn't committed. "Agent Phillips, please," she said, standing up from the bench with careful movements designed to appear non-threatening. "Give me one more chance to contact someone who can verify my service. Just one phone call through appropriate security channels." Phillips shook his head firmly. "Ms. Reyes, you've had multiple opportunities to provide verifiable proof. The marshals are here now, and I'm not going to delay federal proceedings for more unsubstantiated claims." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor as the federal marshals approached the holding cell. Selena could hear the jingle of handcuffs and the creak of leather gear that marked their arrival. Her last chance for freedom was walking away with each step that brought them closer. "Wait!" Selena called out, her voice carrying a note of desperation for the first time since her arrest. "I can prove it. Give me one phone call. There's someone who can verify without compromising security, someone with the right clearances who knows the truth about compartmentalized operations." Staff Sergeant Crowley appeared behind the marshals, his expression showing satisfaction at seeing his investigation vindicated by federal action. "Save it for your lawyer, fake. You've wasted enough of our time with your elaborate stories about classified missions." Agent Phillips gestured for the marshals to proceed. "Ms. Reyes, time's up. These officers will transport you to federal custody where you can pursue whatever legal options are available to you." As the first marshal entered the cell with handcuffs ready, Selena felt her trained reflexes responding to the perceived threat. Years of combat experience had conditioned her to react when cornered, even when logic told her that resistance would only make things worse. "Don't touch me like that," she said sharply, pulling away as Crowley reached for her arm to facilitate the handcuffing process. The movement was instinctive, a trained response to unwanted physical contact that revealed muscle memory developed through years of close-quarters combat. Crowley's response was immediate and forceful. "Resisting arrest too? Just digging yourself deeper, princess." He grabbed her arm more roughly, using his superior size and strength to overpower her resistance. The physical struggle that followed was brief but intense. Selena's training kicked in automatically, her body responding with defensive movements that had been drilled into her through countless hours of hand-to-hand combat instruction. But she was outnumbered and restrained by the confined space of the cell. During the struggle, her long-sleeved shirt caught on the metal edge of the bench and tore completely, exposing her entire forearm to everyone in the corridor. The intricate tattoo that had been partially hidden was now fully visible, its detailed design catching the harsh fluorescent light. "What the hell?" one of the marshals muttered, stopping mid-motion as he noticed the exposed artwork. The tattoo was unlike anything typically seen on civilian fraudsters. The eagle, trident, and anchor were rendered with military precision, but it was the specific modifications that made several observers pause. The eagle's wings were positioned at an exact 73-degree angle, and below the standard symbols were coordinates that meant nothing to most people but everything to those trained to read them. Commander Cole Harlan had been walking past the holding area on his way to a scheduled meeting when the commotion drew his attention. As Deputy Operations Officer for the base, he was accustomed to observing various law enforcement activities, but something about this particular situation compelled him to investigate further. His eyes fell on the exposed tattoo, and the world seemed to stop moving around him. The coordinates 33°6 and 69°12 were burned into his memory from a deployment that had ended in tragedy and loss. The date beneath them marked the day when his team had lost their medic during an IED attack that had nearly killed them all. "Stop," Cole said quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the struggle. Then louder, with command authority that cut through the chaos. "Stop everything! Nobody move!" The authority in his voice was unmistakable, causing everyone in the corridor to freeze in place. Crowley released his grip on Selena's arm, and the marshal stepped back, unsure of why a Navy commander was intervening in their federal operation. Cole pushed through the group, his eyes fixed on the tattoo with an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. He approached Selena slowly, studying the coordinates and symbols with the careful attention of someone confirming an impossible recognition. "Grid reference Foxtrot 77, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Kandahar Province, November 15th, 2011. He looked up at Selena's face, seeing past years of civilian life to the medic who had saved his life and the lives of his teammates. "Doc, it's really you." The corridor fell completely silent. Agent Phillips looked confused, Wright appeared stunned, and Crowley's confident expression began to crack as he realized something was happening that he didn't understand. "Bravo 6 Actual," Selena replied quietly, using the call sign that only members of their unit would know. "I wondered if you'd survived the second rotation." Cole's eyes filled with tears as 12 years of guilt and grief suddenly transformed into overwhelming relief and joy. "We searched for you for 3 days. The blast site was so destroyed we couldn't find. We thought you were dead. We declared you killed in action and sent your family a flag." The emotional weight of the moment hit everyone present. This wasn't a confrontation between law enforcement and a fraud. This was a reunion between brothers in arms who had been separated by war and miscommunication. "Commander," Agent Phillips said carefully, "are you saying you know this woman?" Cole nodded emphatically, wiping his eyes without embarrassment. "Agent Phillips, this is Hospital Corpsman First Class Selena Reyes, call sign Doc. She served with my team for 18 months in Afghanistan. She saved my life and the lives of half my unit during operations that are still classified at levels you don't have access to." He pulled out his secure phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the number he needed. "I'm calling Admiral Patricia Hayes immediately. She was Deputy Director of Naval Special Warfare Operations during Selena's service period. She can verify everything through appropriate channels." The call connected after 2 rings. "Admiral Hayes, this is Commander Cole Harlan. I'm at Naval Station San Diego, and I need emergency authentication for a special operations veteran who's been arrested on stolen valor charges. Her name is Selena Reyes, call sign Doc, and she served with SEAL Team 6 under compartmentalized operations from 2011 to 2013. The response was immediate and decisive. "Commander Harlan, patch me through to the senior investigating officer immediately. I'm authorizing emergency declassification of Ms. Reyes's service record for verification purposes." Within minutes, Agent Phillips was speaking directly with Admiral Hayes, receiving authentication codes and database access credentials that he had never seen before. His tablet screen filled with information that transformed Selena from a suspected fraud into one of the most decorated combat medics in naval history. "Naval Cross," Phillips read aloud, his voice filled with amazement. "Silver Star with V device, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, Combat Medical Badge, 47 confirmed lives saved in direct action missions." The crowd that had gathered to witness a fraud's arrest now stood in stunned silence as the truth was revealed. Crowley's face had gone pale, and Knox appeared to be struggling with the complete reversal of everything she had believed about the case. Cole continued to stare at Selena, his expression cycling through emotions that ranged from joy to guilt to overwhelming relief. "Doc, we left you behind. The blast threw you into a building collapse, and when we couldn't find you after 3 days of searching, we had to assume you were gone." Selena smiled through her own tears, remembering that chaotic day when everything had gone wrong at once. The building collapse saved my life. I was trapped for 4 days before Afghan National Army found me. By then you were gone, and medical records showed me as critically injured rather than killed in action. The misunderstanding that had separated them was finally being resolved, but the cost had been 12 years of believing that friends were dead, families that had grieved unnecessarily, and a service record that had been buried so deeply it had nearly destroyed the person it was meant to protect. Agent Phillips was still reading from Selena's newly revealed record, each detail adding to the magnitude of the mistake that had been made. Specialized in trauma surgery under fire, cross-trained for direct action missions requiring medical expertise, participated in classified operations that resulted in the elimination of high-value targets and the rescue of American hostages. Wright shook her head in amazement. Selena, you saved 47 lives in combat, and today you almost went to prison because nobody believed you. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. A genuine hero had been arrested and humiliated because her service was so classified that it couldn't be verified through normal channels. The system designed to protect her had nearly destroyed her civilian life. Cole was already making additional phone calls, contacting surviving members of their unit to share the incredible news that Doc was alive. Each conversation was filled with the same mixture of disbelief, joy, and grief for the years they had lost thinking she was dead. Jimmy Torres was right, Agent Phillips said, looking toward the recruitment center where the confrontation had begun. He recognized something authentic that the rest of us missed. The consequences of the mistake began cascading through multiple levels of the military and federal systems. Crowley faced immediate disciplinary action for his aggressive handling of a legitimate veteran's case. Knox was reassigned pending investigation of her role in the incident. The database systems that had failed to reveal Selena's true record were flagged for complete overhaul. But beyond the administrative consequences, there was a deeper reckoning taking place. Media coverage of the case exposed systematic failures in how the military treated veterans of classified operations. Congressional oversight committees demanded answers about how many other veterans might be in similar situations, their service unrecognized because it was too sensitive to acknowledge publicly. Admiral Hayes arrived at Naval Station San Diego within hours of the phone call, bringing with her a level of authority that transformed the entire atmosphere surrounding the case. She had spent years overseeing compartmentalized operations, and she understood better than anyone the delicate balance between security and recognition that affected people like Selena. In a ceremony that was both public vindication and private healing, Admiral Hayes personally presented Selena with decorations that should have been awarded years earlier. The Bronze Star with V device was pinned to her civilian shirt, while Cole and other surviving team members stood at attention. The recruitment center had been transformed into an impromptu ceremony space, with the same witnesses who had watched her humiliation now bearing witness to her vindication. Jimmy Torres stood in the front row, tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched the woman he had defended receive the recognition she deserved. Kelly Wright maintained her military bearing, but her pride was evident as she realized she had been one of the few to recognize authentic service despite the bureaucratic failures. Selena Reyes, Admiral Hayes said formally, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority and personal respect. Your service to this nation extended far beyond what most Americans will ever know or understand. You saved lives, completed impossible missions, and sacrificed your own recognition to protect ongoing operations and fellow service members. The Admiral's words resonated through the assembled crowd, each syllable serving as both vindication and education about the hidden sacrifices made by those who serve in the shadows. Agent Phillips stood quietly in the back, his expression reflecting both professional satisfaction at reaching the truth and personal regret at how close the system had come to destroying an innocent person. Staff Sergeant Crowley remained at attention despite his obvious discomfort, his earlier certainty replaced by the humbling reality of how wrong he had been. His aggressive pursuit of what he believed to be justice had nearly resulted in a catastrophic injustice, a lesson that would reshape his approach to similar cases for the remainder of his career. As the formal presentation concluded, Cole stepped forward with several other men whose faces bore the marks of hard years and dangerous service. These were the surviving members of the team that had operated with Selena in Afghanistan, brothers in arms who had spent over a decade believing their medic was dead. "Doc," said a gruff voice from behind Cole. Master Chief Petty Officer Ryan McCarthy emerged from the group, his scarred hands shaking as he approached. "You pulled me out of that building in Helmand Province when the ceiling came down. I've been carrying your dog tags for 12 years, thinking they were all I had left of you." He pulled a worn set of identification tags from beneath his shirt, the metal dulled by years of being carried against his chest. The emotional weight of the gesture struck everyone present as McCarthy pressed the tags into Selena's hands, completing a circle of remembrance that had remained open for too long. The ceremony concluded with Cole approaching Selena with a manila folder marked with security classifications that indicated its sensitive contents. His expression had shifted from joy at reunion to the grim determination of someone preparing to complete unfinished business. "Doc, we have unfinished business," he said, his voice carrying the authority of renewed command responsibility. "The terrorist cell leader who triggered that IED in 2011, Hassan al-Rashid, he survived and he's been running human trafficking operations through the same networks we were trying to disrupt." Selena examined the surveillance photographs inside the folder, recognizing the face of a man who had haunted her memory for 12 years. The images showed a figure who had aged but remained unmistakably the same person whose operations had cost so many American lives and destroyed countless families across multiple countries. "Operation Blackwater Phase 2? She asked, her medical training automatically assessing the intelligence photographs for tactical details that might prove relevant to planning a new mission. Cole nodded grimly, his expression reflecting both the weight of unfinished responsibility and the hope that comes with having the right team reassembled. "We never completed the mission because we thought you were dead and the medical expertise was irreplaceable. Now that we know you're alive, we can finally finish what we started." The open loop of her military service was being offered a chance for closure. The mission that had been interrupted by tragedy and miscommunication could finally be completed by the same team that had started it, reunited after more than a decade of believing they would never fight together again. Admiral Hayes observed the exchange with the satisfaction of someone who understood that sometimes the most important military operations were those that addressed unfinished business. "The Secretary of Defense has already been briefed on this situation," she added quietly. "If you choose to accept this mission, you'll have full support and appropriate resources." "Some wounds never heal until justice is served," Selena said quietly, tying her bootlaces with the same precision that had marked her military service. The simple action carried symbolic weight for everyone who recognized it as preparation for a return to active operations. "Let's bring our people home," she continued, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had never forgotten the ultimate purpose of their service. The story that had begun with humiliation and false accusations had evolved into vindication and renewed purpose. Selena Martinez had learned that sometimes the greatest service requires fighting battles that nobody will ever know about, including the battle to prove that such service ever existed at all. But now, with her record restored and her team reunited, she was ready to face whatever missions lay ahead. The warrior who had been forced to hide was finally free to fight again,